Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We are sorry we got started a little bit late, but we're really glad that you're here. And tonight we're going to be talking about our kids, our schools, and the legislature, and how this is impacting us. We will also be having an opportunity toward the end for question and answer. We have interpretation. We have ASL interpretation tonight. And apologies, I'm just making sure everybody's spotlit. June, can you put a spotlight on Vivian as well? So we've got Vice President of the Seattle School Board, Liza Rankin, and we have School Board Director Vivian Song Maritz with us tonight. And I'm really excited to have them join us. And before I say anything more, I will let each of them, I will do a visual description of myself. This is something we do for accessibility reasons. So my name is Samantha Fogg. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the president of Seattle Council PTSA. I'm really happy that you're here. To some people, I appear to be white. To others, I do not. I am, in fact, both Chinese and white. And I am wearing a headset, and I have dark hair that's going gray that's been pulled back. And my background has my name, and it has the logo for Seattle Council PTSA. It's a white background. And then I'll let Liza and then Vivian do a brief introduction, and then we'll get into a few other things as people are coming into the room. So Liza.
Thank you, Sam, and thank you so much to Seattle Council PTSA for supporting us with this meeting tonight. We have so much we could talk about, but we'll try to keep our information portion as condensed as we can so we can get to questions. My name is Liza Rankin. I am the Vice President and Legislative Liaison for Seattle Public Schools Board of Directors. I am also the parent of 2 children in Seattle Public Schools. I use she, her pronouns. I am a middle-aged white woman. I'm wearing a pink shirt. I have a blurred background, and I have dark hair pulled away from my face. Vivian.
Thank you, Liza. We'll pass to Vivian.
Hi, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining tonight, and thank you to SCPTSA for hosting us. I am Vivian Song Maritz. I am a school board director representing District 4. I'm also a parent in Seattle Public Schools. I have 4 kids. I use she, her pronouns. I identify as Asian American, and tonight my hair is down, it's dark, and I'm wearing a pink sweatshirt. Thank you.
Thank you. And then before we get started, I want to take a moment and acknowledge that even though we're in a virtual space, I am on the unceded territory of the Coast Salish people. And that word unceded is important, and especially as we're working together and thinking about some of these complicated topics, it's something good to keep in mind. And I also wanted to go over a few access things. If you would like live transcription, closed captions as provided by Zoom, you can turn those on. We have ASL interpretation, and our interpreters are spotlit. If there are accommodations that you need that are not currently being met, you can put a message in the chat that will go to hosts. If you would prefer to text me, you can do that as well, and that means that you can ask for an accommodation confidentially. And my phone number is in the chat. As an accommodation, we do have our chat turned off today, and the reason for that is we want to make sure that our speakers get the opportunity to say the things that they need to say, and that we get to ask questions, and that we would need to read the chat out loud. And if I'm interrupting to read the entire chat throughout the meeting, it makes it hard for our speakers to be able to get the information that you need. But what you can do, if you have questions tonight or things that you want to get to our school board directors or to participate in the Q&A, is you can use the chat to communicate to our hosts. And we'll be pulling questions from the chat at the end. And so I wanted to, again, welcome everyone and make sure that we had all of the things that we needed to get done. And I am going to hand off to Director Maritz to get us started in the question of what is the board's role? And I'll hand off to you. Thank you.
Can we put up the slides? And
yes.
While that's happening,
June, have you got the?
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. Just before we get into what the school board does, next slide, please. I just want to cover what we plan to discuss tonight. We're going to start off with some level setting with what the school board's role is and what the state legislature's role is. Liza will cover some legislative session basics. I will be talking about our school district's budget and current financial position. Then Liza will kind of go into a deeper dive about what is happening in the 2023 state legislative session. And then we will have time for questions, and SCPTSA will close for us. Next slide, please. So who does what? In Washington State, and I'm sorry, before I start that, I think it's important for us to do some level setting. I think some of this information will be familiar to a lot of you, but I want to make sure that all of those that are joining, that we're starting from a base level of understanding, and so we can have a constructive and collaborative conversation at the end of this session. So in terms of who does what, in Washington State, we have local governance within a statewide education system. And what that means is the state legislature is responsible for funding our public kindergarten through 12th grade schools. And they also make laws and requirements for school districts to follow. This local school board, and that's Liza and I are one and two of a 7-member school board, are actually authorized by the state to serve as community representatives, to set the vision, mission, and strategic goals for Seattle Public Schools, to hire, supervise, and evaluate the superintendent. And this is a responsibility that we will go into deep dive about tonight, which is to establish and oversee the budget. We're also responsible for reviewing, revising, and adopting policies for the school district to follow. And finally, monitoring the district's progress towards its goals. Next slide, please. So why should we as parents and community members care about the state legislative session? The first reason is that the vast majority of our schools funding comes from the state legislature. So up on the left, I have a pie chart. This actually comes from our school district's published, adopted 22-23 school year budget. And it shows that 59% of our funding comes directly from the state. The state also has restrictions on how much local taxes we are able to raise for our school districts. So in a sense, the local taxes are also controlled and dictated by the state legislature. And that is a combination of 75% of our school district's funding is determined by the state. We also need to care about state funding and the state legislative session, because historically speaking, the state funding has fallen short and for schools, not just in Seattle Public Schools, but statewide. And it's in particular fallen short in some key categories. Up until fairly recently, the state was funding just 9 school nurses for our entire district of 106 schools. And the last state legislative session, they did increase the number of school nurses that they would fund. But in the middle here, I have a screenshot of a slide that the school district shared at a budget work session in February. And it shows 3 categories where the state is inadequately funding our schools. So the first category is special education. Our district spends $191 million on special education, and currently the state is funding $96 million. The same is true of transportation and admin staff at schools. That's mostly principals. So in sum, if you look at on that slide, the shortfall in these categories is $140 million. In a subsequent slide, I will be sharing with you what the entire district's budget deficit is, which is $131 million. So these are very significant shortfalls in state funding. Next slide, please.
All right, thanks, Vivian. So as the state determines the amounts that go into all of those items and expenditures that Vivian was just talking about on a biannual basis. So the Washington State Legislature, and I'm just going to read from the slide, the legislature is made up of 2 houses or chambers, the Senate and the House of Representatives. And they meet in session in Washington State each year. We have a limited session. Some states have longer or year-round kind of sessions. We have limited sessions in Washington State where these 2 chambers meet to pass new laws, change existing laws, and enact budgets. So the legislative cycle is 2 years long, or they call it a biennium. So right now we're looking at the 2023-2025 biennium. The cycle, within that cycle, the odd numbered years for regular session are 105 days long, and the even number years are 60 days long. So sometimes you'll hear people refer to the odd number year sessions as the long session or the budget session, because those additional days are when they spend time setting the budget for the next 2 years for the whole state. And then what usually happens in a 60-day session is there will be some supplemental budgetary decision-making going on, but typically what happens is bills that didn't make it to the finish line in the long session, other issues that come up, things that don't impact the budget as much. Excuse me. So bills are, when session starts in January, bills are introduced by members of either chamber in that chamber, and they have to pass through 3 readings in each chamber to pass the legislature and then continue on to the governor's desk to be signed into law. So we're about 2/3 of the way through the current legislative session. This year is a long session. And so bills start in policy committees, have to go through 3 hearings to be passed by the chamber of origin. They go over to the other chamber, so they swap, and then the bill is heard at least 3 times before it passes in the opposite chamber. So by the time a bill becomes a law, it has passed 2 chambers to arrive at the governor's desk. During this time, lots of bills don't make it through even a first reading in their chamber of origin. There are various cutoffs during session where, there's no more new policy, no more new hearings in policy committees. Or there's also a deadline for when it has to pass from the chamber of origin to the other chamber for it to be considered still in play for the session. So the same happens with the budget. The budget is passed in each chamber with a bill number. So if you look up online, Senate budget, it can be not immediately easy to find because it's actually got a bill number attached to it. So the Senate drops their budget, the House drops their budget. They don't look the same. There's some things in common, but there's lots of, there's big discrepancies in amounts that go to different priorities. And where we are now in the session is that both budgets have dropped, and now they're going to hear and debate and go back and forth until they reach a budget that both chambers agreed upon to become the budget for the next year. There's also a capital budget. So that what I've been referring to as the budget is really the operating budget. There's also a capital budget that each chamber presents and debates. And schools are impacted by that. And we usually make requests for specific projects. There's certain grants that are available that districts can apply for called like distressed school grants. We've been the beneficiaries of those in the past, but they're very finite projects that districts will request and then, hopefully get funding for. So don't want to go into too much of it right now, but we had some skills center related capital projects that we requested that the Senate has in their capital budget proposal, and the House has almost didn't even need to bother because the comparison between the two is hugely different. So, that's something that we'll be watching to see where it ends up for those projects. So yeah, eventually that becomes the budget for the state, and that determines how much money school districts have to spend. So I can't remember if this is in a future slide, but while this is happening, school districts are required by law to pass balanced budgets every year. And they have to do that process as the Senate or as the legislature is determining their process. So the SPS budget planning for September that has to be approved by no later than August is being done without 100% knowing what the state funding is actually going to be. Challenging. Let's go to the next slide. Oh, so along with the legislative session at the state level, what we do at the board level is approve a legislative agenda every year before the legislative session starts, so that the board is giving authorization and direction to the district to advocate on our behalf, on the behalf of the whole community. And our priorities were established with a number of community engagements, but a lot of them were connected to a process that was done last year. But anyway, that's getting into the weeds. So this session, as the legislative liaison, I can speak with legislators on behalf of the board in alignment with our priorities. The same way that, a PTA legislative liaison or a PTA president is authorized by membership to say, on behalf of the Bryant PTA, I'm here to ask, et cetera, et cetera. So I can say, on behalf of Seattle Public Schools, we ask that, et cetera, as opposed to just like, hi, my name's Liza, and I had this thing I wanted to ask you about. But having the legislative priorities be adopted by the board authorizes me to do that and authorizes staff to advocate within those priorities with legislators. And so our top priorities, and we can share the link if it's not here somewhere. There's more details in these priorities, but we wanted to address funding gaps in basic education as our #1 priority. And as Vivian said earlier, those areas most significantly are in special education and transportation. Those are both things that are considered basic education under the definition of the state. And this in our state's constitution, unlike many, maybe any other state, our state's constitution says that education is the paramount duty of the state. So special education is basic education. Transportation for students to access school is basic education. And these funding gaps are consistent throughout the whole state. The Washington School Directors Association, or WASDA, top priorities, special education and transportation funding. Individual districts all over the state, special education, transportation are their biggest gaps in funding. And then our other priorities were supporting student learning, supporting student well-being, providing stable and equitable operation. And there are more details about what that exactly means in the document that Vivian linked to. We keep them somewhat broad in terms of priority because when we set these, we don't know exactly what bills are going to be up for discussion. So they're specific, but also catch a lot of things so that we do have the opportunity to advocate for things that we know are important to our community when the legislature is in session. Vivian.
Thank you. So what is the district's financial position right now? So the district has been running a structural deficit for several years now. A structural deficit happens when your revenues, resources, or funding, we use those terms sort of interchangeably, are not enough to cover expenses, expenditures, or costs. The district is required to have a balanced budget. And so what we have been doing is band-aiding this with mostly one-time money. I think a clear example of that would be the emergency COVID funding called ESSER. As the district is planning its 2023-24 and 24-25 school year budgets, the district is in a situation where they are running out of Band-Aids and they will have to make some structural changes. One of the reasons why our revenues are falling short of our expenses is because of enrollment declines. And the state funds our district on a per student basis, and then the district allocates resources to the individual schools on a per student basis as well. So you can, on this slide, I have just a screenshot from a presentation the district gave to school board directors at a budget work session in February. And if you look at the last few lines, it says legislative current. This is what Liza was describing previously. Because we need to have a budget submitted, we need to be doing the budget work now, but the legislative session is still in progress. We have some placeholders, essentially guesses for what the state will approve, but it will not be known until after April 23rd, when the legislative session ends. And next slide. So I wanted to share some information about why the enrollment is declining, because enrollment is so important to our budget. It's the basis of how we're coming up with a budget. And, oh, are we not sharing the slides anymore? Okay, well, I'll just kind of describe them.
Yeah, I'll get it up shortly, sorry.
Okay, no problem. What I wanted to share with you are some screenshots of charts from a presentation by Shoreline School District. And I'm intentionally sharing information presented by a school district to help build awareness that these declining enrollment trends in Seattle are being seen by other districts. They are regional, state, and even national trends. And declining enrollment is primarily being driven by lower birth rates, and in particular in communities like Bellevue and Seattle. The other factor is high housing costs. So in this screenshot on the right, you will see these are King County births, and they're starting to decline. And in particular, in this presentation, they're calling out next year's kindergarten class. That was a low birth year, and therefore many districts in King County are predicting a small kindergarten class, and therefore we have a smaller enrollment for our district in the 23-24 school year. So next slide. I think it's back to you, Liza.
Thank you. And I'll just add to what Vivian was just talking about. We get, as a WASDA member, I get kind of a media roundup from around the state. And I'm going to start collecting them, I think, into one document. Every state, I mean, the states, every local journalism website, any kind of reporting from any local area within Washington state is putting out essentially the same article about education and about budgets. And you could almost just swap out the names of the districts and swap out the numbers based on the size of the district, and it's the same story. It's the same story all across the state. And then, you know, we're funded different from other states. So, but compared to the country, as Vivian was saying, you know, the birth rates nationally are having an impact on school districts all across the country. So specifically with our first funding priority in the legislative priorities, you know, we talked about special education and transportation being the biggest gaps. So I wanted to share a little bit about the specific bills. These are both SSB, and that means Substitute Senate Bill. So when it was first introduced in the Senate, it would have just been SB for Senate Bill. And then the number that it was assigned when it was submitted by the sponsor. And it's SSB because it's now a substitute version of the bill. So as each reading happens and as bills go through various committees, the letters at the beginning change depending on what version they're on. If you go onto the Washington Legislature homepage, you can click on bill information and you can put the bill number for anything in there, and it will show you the most recent version of the bill and then the history of that bill during the session. So this bill is specifically for special education funding. There was one in the House as well that started off pretty amazing. It really was the full package for what districts are lacking from the state right now. And it just got kind of hacked to pieces as it moved forward in the House until it was basically not a change in funding. So this is what's called the vehicle. It's the bill that's moving forward that is going to ultimately be what legislators are looking at when they make the budgets. They will look at the funding related to this bill for increases in special education. This bill increases the multiplier The multiplier is a factor that's used by the state to fund special education. As Vivian talked about earlier, everything is done on a per pupil basis. That's just an allocation formula that's actually, it's not actually connected to what it costs to educate one student. And, you know, if you, not to get too much into vouchers and whatnot, but, you know, the per pupil amount is to provide an allocation to districts to serve students. If you take out that student and take out that money and attach it to that student to go somewhere else, it's actually not, well, first, you know, public, private, anyway, vouchers I don't think are a good idea for lots and lots of reasons, but that cost isn't directly correlated to, I mean, that amount isn't directly correlated to the cost it takes to educate a child. This is just how the state has decided to provide funding to districts through this formula. So every student has a general education allocation to them. So if we have 50,000 students, we get from the state 50,000 units of money. The multiplier, what that means is that for every student who has an IEP, who qualifies for an IEP, and qualifying for an IEP is under federal law that protects the rights of students with disabilities. It's not an extra fun to have. It is a documented need. And when you qualify and have an IEP, that's a legal document that's enforceable at the federal and state levels. It is federal law. So, and then it's the law that districts provide education in accordance with what's in that document. Again, it's not an extra fun, nice to have. It's actually what defines how that particular student accesses basic education. So the multiplier is a factor that our state uses to increase funding per student over the general allocation for every student that has an IEP. Again, that money, the amount of that money is not connected in any way to the actual services of that actual student. It's not even connected to services of students as a whole. It's no matter what's in the IEP, the multiplier is the same amount for every student with an IEP. So as I'm sure many of you know from experience and also can imagine, an IEP could be, you know, a half an hour of reading support a couple times a week, or it could be a one-to-one aid and significant accessibility factors. It, you know, there's, when you look at an IEP, there's no way to know how much it might cost to provide the services that's in there just by it being an IEP. So the funding, the multiplier is just an amount, an arbitrary amount that goes to each student with an IEP. And that amount is not sufficient to cover the cost of providing those services to students in Seattle and in districts all across the state. Additionally, our state has a cap on that multiplier funding. Right now it's 13.5%, which means that every kid gets a general education per pupil allocation. If they're an IEP, if there are IEPs, the district gets the additional multiplier per IEP until the number of IEPs in a district is 13.5% of students or higher. Then the state does not add that multiplier per those students. So this bill will increase the multiplier, which is the factor that goes to each student with an IEP to districts, and it will raise the cap from 13.5% to 15%, which is better than 13.5%, but it still is putting a limit on the number of students who will have their civil rights, according to federal law, recognized and funded by the state. So districts still must, by law, by moral, ethical reasons, provide services for any student who qualifies for an IEP, but the state limits how many students they will provide that funding for. So that's, we have gaps both in the multiplier not providing adequate funding for the cost of providing services, and then there's this cap that at some point stops providing the multiplier. Seattle Public Schools is currently at 15.16% of our student population that has IEPs. So we are well above the 13.5% current cap, and we are also just above the new lifted cap. And there are districts that have 18% of their students that qualify for IEPs. And there are really small districts that the difference of 1 or 2 students is much more significant in terms of what that funding looks like and what they have access to in a smaller community. So this bill we support it in alignment with the priorities that we have put forward. The ask that WASDA has made and our position in Seattle Public Schools is thank you for this increased investment in special education funding. This is a good first step towards ultimately fully funding education. In no way, shape, or form should people believe that this solves the funding gap for special education, but it is progress and it is appreciated, and we still need to do more. The student transportation funding started out pretty strong. It addressed both this is again a formula. There's a funding formula that the state funds transportation to districts, and it in Seattle, in many other districts, doesn't actually cover the cost of providing transportation. They had a factor to account for more dense urban districts like ours, and to account for increased costs in sparse rural districts where there are many fewer students, but they're further apart. That's more expensive. So there was a factor in there to adjust that, and it would have fully covered reimbursed districts for funding for special transportation. Special transportation is considered by the state any transportation that's required by the IEP of a student. It's for students designated as McKinney-Vento, which would be students living homeless, and for foster students. So those students often need individual transportation, and the original bill would have fully reimbursed districts for any costs related to those students. The current version of the bill doesn't change the formula anymore, and doesn't have this language in it that fully covers that special transportation, but it does have significantly larger than has been safety net fund, which is designated money that's not allocated that districts can basically submit receipts for, and they'll be reimbursed from that. So that amount of safety net funding should be enough to meet the needs of special transportation. We still have the underlying formula that doesn't fund our actual costs in transportation. So not super great news. The other, bigger, so those are 2 specific bills. The other bigger pieces, of course, are that the House and Senate have both released their operating and capital budgets. People are scrambling to compare the 2, look at the different investments. From our position for special education, the funding level provided in 5311 is what we would like to see the House also come up to in a final budget, and the same with transportation. There's other things that we could get into, but they're not as directly related to the budget, so I'll just save that for another time. and go back over to, let's see, Vivian.
Thank you. So what does this mean for my students? As we've been discussing before, the district is currently in the process of writing its 23-24 school year budget, while the state legislature has not finalized its funding for the 23-24 and 24-25 school years. So we are in a moment where we are doing our best guesses for what will happen with enrollment and what will our schools look like next year. And we're also waiting to get more information from the state. And so there is opportunity for us to have conversations as a community and with our legislators about what the needs of our students are. And in a dynamic where we've got historical and anticipated constrained funding from the state, plus the declining enrollment, it will mean less money for our schools, and we will have to make good decisions to avoid having negative impact to our students' experiences. And again, we just want to reiterate that the districts and the schools are funded on a per student basis. And this is the reason why we will have less money for our schools, because we are going to have less students. So I think that is the last slide, right, Liza? And so we wanted to keep that section quite brief, but kind of level set with everybody. And now we would very much like to answer your questions.
So Sam has sent me a couple of questions that have come through the chat, and one of them is really easy to answer. So I'll take that one first. The question is, can the district share a deep dive of special education and transportation budgets so that the public can understand why there is such a difference in expenditures versus revenue? And this person says, I'm not suggesting we cut those costs. I just want to understand those costs. So we do have an SPS staff member with us this evening on here. So I'm sure she is taking notes, and I also will absolutely relay to the staff, to the superintendent and staff, that there is interest in seeing more of these things. We could talk about some of them, but I don't have the materials with me right now. But I mean, when revenues and expenditures don't line up, either you're spending too much or you don't have enough money. That's just and the biggest cost in special education, as it is in general education, is literally people. It's paying for staff, and staff is hugely important, critical. Staff is how we educate students. Teachers are who spends all of their time with our children, providing extra supports, all of those things. And especially in a city as expensive as Seattle, they need, people need to afford to have those jobs. So that the shortest answer would be that staffing costs are higher than the state feels like they should be. I'm not totally sure. But we can definitely get more specific data and overview about that. There's also, it doesn't break it down into what the expenditures are, but another WASDA member created this amazing data set and interactive map about, that compares special education funding versus the shortfall in every district in the state. It's like, I love maps and data, and so you put them together, it's really impressive. And it also really just shows how widespread this problem is. I think the question about what does the money go to is something that the whole state needs to get better about talking about, because if we're not super specific, then the legislature, I think, just hears, well, you just want more money. We just gave you more money. You have plenty of money, just spend it differently. I think we really need, as a whole state, to come together around, especially special education, because we're outliers to the rest of the country about serving students in inclusive settings, outcomes for students with disabilities. It's not good. And so I think just getting into what the costs are and what's effective, and adopting best practices is critical. Specifically for Seattle, I know that we can get that information about just how the funding works, what's it spent on. But the short answer would be people who are super important. And I know our transportation folks have been doing a ton of analysis about spending and trying to, for next year, ensure that we have the most stable provision of services that we can, but within the means that we have. But we can definitely I will talk to staff about how to present that, how to get that information out. And then, yeah.
One of the questions is, we know that inclusion is more cost effective and leads to better outcomes for all students. It sounds like Seattle Public Schools is moving in this direction. Sorry, something just added. Okay, how much do you estimate the district might save once inclusion is in place at SPS? I don't know that I have seen an actual financial estimate for cost savings. I think the district is moving in this direction because it does believe that it will result in better outcomes for students, which is the primary goal for the district. If we are seeing the outcomes that we desire for our students, and I mean all of our students, I think we will reorganize our resources in a way that will make this happen. My personal hypothesis is that to the extent that we're serving students earlier, better earlier on, we will, those students will need less intensive supports later on in their time in the school district, and we will see cost savings from that. That is a hypothesis, and I don't think that we have attempted to estimate the cost savings, because the objective there is just to drive better academic outcomes. Should I read another question? I appreciate that the enrollment number for kindergarten has gone down, but why do the rest of the grades have to be impacted? So the primary impact that any school would be seeing at this point is based on whatever is projected for that individual school. So let's just take the example of an elementary school. If the enrollment for a kindergarten is going down, the total enrollment for K through 5 or K through 8 will have gone down. And so you will have to adjust the staffing for that building accordingly. I think that's what the person who was asking that question was getting at. And if not, please ask your question again.
Well, can I add to that too, that the kindergarten enrollment has gone down several years in a row. So the first year of kindergarten enrollment that was down are now like 3rd or 4th graders, 4th or 5th graders. So it just continues to impact how many students are moving into upper grades. I know well, it's actually not just anecdotal, but my son's, the class ahead of my older son, who are now like 9th graders, there was a big bubble. That class, for whatever reason, was larger. It was a larger cohort than the classes before it. So I know a lot of elementary schools, the year that cohort went from elementary to middle school, reduced a 5th grade classroom, because there was just this kind of bubble that had moved, so they would increase a class every time this cohort of kids moved up a grade level, and then have to decrease it again, just based on the, I don't know what was happening the year that those kids were born. But there was a bubble. And so now we kind of have the opposite, where actually during the pandemic, when we estimated that there would be the first drop in enrollment, the first year back, so 2021, we actually had a higher than expected secondary enrollment. Secondary, including middle school and high school. So I don't know if any of you had kids at schools, you might have remembered some scramble to increase staffing during the fall enrollment adjustments, because there more secondary students returned in the fall that year than had been anticipated. And so this, this whole, the bubble will keep, or I don't know, the decrease will just keep going, and just means that smaller cohorts are moving up through the system.
And one more thing I wanted to add was that if you look at the proposed changes to the budget for the 23-24 school year, a lot of the cuts are actually happening in central office, but in terms of the cuts that are happening at the school building level, many of them are actually happening at elementary school, which is because it's a reflection of the decline in enrollment in kindergarten, and as those grades kind of move forward through our system.
Let's see, and Sam, will you let me know if we miss one? I'm trying to follow through the chat here. Principals have already gone through their budget process and proposed cuts in FTE to staff. Which part of the budget has SPS not finalized? When is the cutoff for telling teachers they no longer have jobs, i.e. budget stay the same versus getting more money from the state? So there's a couple different factors in that question, actually. So in February, every year, and this is, forget for a moment that there's a budget deficit. This is just the process of SPS. In February, the district provides buildings with the enrollment projections for the next fall, based on tons of data, and Vivian has been showing some of that. But the biggest factor is birth rates. So the biggest factor is the birth rate. 5 years later, that's how many kindergartners, on and on and on. So the district in February provides buildings with, here's the estimated enrollment for your school for the fall, and based on that enrollment, here is your staffing allocation through the district formula for distributing staff, and then here is your discretionary or flexible funding. And so the principal and the BLT, which is the building leadership team, will look at that together and make some initial decisions. In a year like this year, which is a budget year, it's making some assumptions about what's going to come through the budget. Some assumptions about what's going to come through, but when all is said and done, the budget from the state might end up being different than what we expected. Based on what bills have dropped, there's not going to be a change in the basic way that the state is funding districts. There's not going to be a big reduction. There's not going to be a big increase for the general allocations to districts. So we have, our district staff has decent information about how much money we'll be getting from the state based on the number of students. The number of students is smaller than it was this year, which is projected to be, that means that the budget is going to be less than this year's. That's not the same as a cut. That's in alignment with enrollment, because everything is tied to how many students there are. So there's also contract implications in here. So when we talk about different choices being made at buildings, the district nor a building can say, well, we've decided to have 60 kids in one classroom, so we're going to fire half of our staff because we've decided that to save money, we're going to have 60 kids in one classroom. That would be majorly in violation of the contract with our educators. They can't do that. And so the allocation and the annual process in alignment with enrollment is the same this year as it is every year. The final, since this question says which part is not finalized, nothing is final until the superintendent presents the board with the final budget package and we vote on it. We have been having budget work sessions, and those are all public and I believe recorded and on the website, and if they're on YouTube, and if they're not there, you can ask for them for sure and get the recordings from the board office. So there are conversations that happen throughout the year to get board director feedback, input on, staff saying, here's the situation right now, here's what we're looking at, here's what options we might have, and get kind of our response from there. And continue on until we get to the point where the state requires budgets to be approved by August. Seattle Public Schools typically has the board vote in end of June, beginning of July. And I don't want to misinform. I know there are certain cutoffs for what's the word, displacement, or letting teachers know that because of where student enrollment is, they will be, going to a different building. And then there's a different cutoff for saying, you don't have a job. That would be a reduction in force. And that's that's not something I'm aware of happening, but so I don't know the exact cutoff, but basically there's the February estimate, and districts put together their buildings put together their first budgets that then they submit back to the district. And then in June, there's another round of looking at projections to try to get a closer look to what might happen in September. And that, I think it's after that process that kind of final notices go out of placements. And then when school starts again in the fall, it's not until October that there is an actual head count, and then final adjustments are made between buildings, and then it's essentially set. I hope that was the answer. So, but the in terms of from the state legislative session is scheduled to end April 23rd. The governor can call for a special session. That's happened before, where they extend the session. And then we don't necessarily know what the final budget is from the state until then. But every time a bill has been amended, every time there's, the budget drop, different things, our staff immediately starts like running all of those numbers and figuring out the impact on the budget. So that's constantly going on. I don't think I answered the question, but I hope that was information that was somewhat what you were asking. Vivian, do you want to ask the next one? Do you want me to take the next one?
I see from the chat, is there any data on how many kids are going to private and charter schools? I did include a chart at the end of this presentation that pulls information from the Board of Education and OSPI and it shows enrollment in King County in private schools. And what I would say is that from looking at the numbers, it doesn't seem like there was a groundswell of enrollment in private schools that would explain the enrollment decline. Anecdotally talking to some directors at private schools that I reached out to, they didn't grow their capacity in recent years. So they weren't really in a position to absorb more students. And so I think that, of course, anecdotally, we probably all know families that have made a individual decision to send their child to a private school or a charter school. But when we are looking at numbers in aggregate, I don't think that this is the main reason why we have a decline in enrollment. What the demographers and team who are projecting enrollment are telling us that it's really about declining birth rates. And a lot of families are unable to stay in Seattle because in communities like Bellevue and Mercer Island because houses are so expensive.
Yeah, public school enrollment has gone down. Private school enrollment has also gone down. Even though some, there's switching between the two. But yeah, and that information was actually harder than I wanted it to be to find on the State Board of Ed website, but it's there. Let's see, how are we doing on time? Oh, pretty good. Sam, I don't want to miss a question. Is there one that we should?
Liza, I see one that says, for all the changes coming in 24-25, will the weighted staffing standard be changed? Will it be revamped or updated? Will it be different than how things are going to for fall?
Should I say what I want to have happen, or I believe that it has to be revamped. And this is, I'm going to get into sort of my so the weighting staffing standard is not subject to board approval. It is an allocation model that the budget department has been using to allocate staffing to schools. It has changed some in recent years, especially to add equity tiering and some other adjustments to reflect, instead of having just equal staff, no matter what, to respond to student need and different characteristics of different schools. But there's basically a general allocation model that you have X number of students, you get X number of staff. I would feel comfortable saying that, I would say with the enrollment decline and with changes that districts are being forced to make, my feeling is there is an opportunity to make changes that we want to make as well. I'm saying that diplomatically enough. I think it will have to be revamped to adjust to the new reality and also to just reflect what the priorities of the community are and how our students are doing, quite honestly. At the very least, we know that we have our comprehensive neighborhood schools and we have option schools and we have alternative learning providers. And at the very least, we need to structurally recognize that those different programs have different needs and that the Concords and the middle colleges and the schools that every year seem to go, oh my gosh, if that happens, that's going to totally change our program. At the very least, I think there need to be some adjustments made. And I think the board, actually, Vivian and I were talking about this earlier today. I think where the board can and should take some action is at the policy level, not to tell the district how they should deploy money or staff, because that's really not our wheelhouse. But I think some policy changes to provide stronger direction about the need to maintain programs that the district has committed to, and to look at what that, you know, what does that actually mean? What do we need to sustain this program? I think is something that is definitely needs to happen ASAP.
If you have watched any of the district's budget presentations, the term well-resourced schools may be familiar to you. And I can't say that I've had a direct conversation with Dr. Jones and district staff, but I would venture to guess that once the community lands on a definition of what a well-resourced school is, that one of the mechanisms for how the district will execute that is by changing the WSS.
Yeah.
Let me see. Our K-8 is not experiencing enrollment decline, but we are going from a 0.5 counselor allocation for K-5 and 0.5 counselor allocation for 6-8 to 0.5 only for middle school, 0 allocation in the K-5 at a school of about 500. The latest contract was supposed to provide more counselor FTE. What happened? At a high level, the way I would explain this is that there's still fundamentally, the state is still underfunding our school district when it comes to school counselors and school nurses. So in the last state legislative session, they did add more funding, but part of that is going to be phased through time, and it's still not funding enough to the level I think that a lot of us in the community would like to see. And given that, and just broadly speaking, financial pressures, the district has to find a way to allocate resources and so that it can balance its budget. So it did change, I think, some of the thresholds in this year's weighted staffing standards. And that's likely what happened there, that even though your school is not getting enrollment decline, the thresholds for getting a certain allocation of counselor did change in the WSS.
Maybe I might, yes, and I think so. The other thing that might have happened is schools used to get a 0.5, I can't remember exactly what it was called, but like a 0.5
certificated core.
Yes, thank you. Certificated core that a lot of schools had been using, and certificated core meaning, you know, player's choice. Here's a 0.5. You can say where you want to have it. Some schools were using that for a counselor or a family support worker. Some schools were using that to make another 0.5 position into a 0.1, or, you know, I don't know. I'm sure it varies building to building. When there were commitments made in the budget to fund a 0.5 counselor or social worker at, I know at least every elementary, and then I can't remember exactly, but there's different for middle school and high school. An assumption was made that, oh, now that that's going to be funded centrally from the district, and schools are going to be provided a 0.5 counselor, schools don't need that 0.5 certificated core anymore. They don't need district thought schools don't need us to give them that flexible 0.5 anymore because we're giving them a 0.5 counselor, which is the thing that they wanted. If schools had a 0.5 counselor that now the district is funding, that is just a one-to-one, that was just a swap of the funding. Didn't change their situation. If a school was using that 0.5 for something else, then suddenly they're like, oh, wait, that's not what we were using that for. And so it's actually the impact of the adjustment was different for some schools. I don't know if this question is from Broadview Thompson, but I know that Broadview Thompson has that question too. And I have this on my list to ask specifically, like, what's going on there, because if the K-8s, like I have a question for the superintendent about the allocation of counselors specifically to K-8s, because I'm wondering if there is something that's just not, if everything has to do with the number of students, 500 K-5 students is different than 500 students at a K-8. And so I'm wondering if there's a math, I'm not sure. But I'm wondering, Vivian, don't you think that there's something funky? I don't know if this is Broadview Thompson, but I know they had the same question, and that was something that I'm writing down again, because that's something I meant to ask about last week, actually.
Yeah, let's dig into that and follow up. Yeah. But instead of speculating, let's just look into it.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Talking about declining enrollment, I did see a graph of percentage change by elementary school and noticed that there is a trend. Elementary schools near urban villages with increasing multifamily are declining much less or not at all than others. Is this type of analysis being done to inform decisions about funding by elementary school? The answer to that question is that the district is getting data from the city of Seattle about what kind of housing and where the housing is being built. And that information is being given to our demographers who are coming up with enrollment projections. So it is informing our enrollment projections and therefore will have influence on the funding by schools. So yes, they are using that information.
And that's also something else that's happening in the legislature right now is, and a big reason for the discrepancies in the House budget and the Senate budget is the House budget, ironically, has a lot of funding for missing middle housing. And so the projections that we have now are based on what we know now and what the best guess is for what could happen, and knowing that our city is mostly zoned for single family. So actually, oh shoot, do we have the link for that? The capital teams, Flow Analytics did also an enrollment presentation to the capital teams that has, you can see exactly the trend that you're talking about here in the graph, that where there is more single family housing, people are not moving out. I mean, I live in a house I live in Lake City, but in a mostly single family neighborhood. And I had 2 kids that were in elementary school. They have gotten older. There's not 2 new elementary school students coming into my house. We're staying here. And on a larger scale, that's what's happening. You can actually see, I looked at projections for 10 years into the future. And you can see that, like, the Eckstein Middle School boundary area, for example, is going to decline more than some other areas with more multifamily. Exactly what you're talking about. And so that's all something that we have to act on what's happening now, but also not completely screw over the people in our positions 10 years from now and hopefully set them up for, and that's also why, you know, some people have asked, not here, but, you know, oh, if we're having a budget shortfall, why are we building new schools, or why are we expanding schools? Because the life of a school building is 50 to 75 years. And yeah, the next 10 years, we've got an enrollment decline, but then it's projected to start going back up again. And, you know, we don't want to leave the children 15 years from now being crammed into portables and things when we have the opportunity to preserve their school spaces now. So yes, it is being looked at.
I think I missed one from earlier. Can the district publish a list of positions cut in the central office? Jennifer Matter, who is the president of Seattle Education Association, said several of them were related to teachers, professional development, and otherwise. I don't know the exact answer to that. I will follow up on that. What I would say is that what Dr. Jones's approach when it came to budget adjustments in central office was that he asked every single department to do across the board 15% adjustment. So that was, I think all of the budgets, all the departments were impacted. So that that is likely that that department was impacted. I just don't know which positions and if the district is in a position to share that information, but we will follow up on that.
So this is Sam, and I'm seeing that we're at 8:20, and there is a question in the chat that I'm actually going to take, and it is, what can we do to help, and how can we move our legislators? And the reason that I'm going to take this one is because school board directors are allowed to inform. They are not allowed to direct advocacy. And I'll note that this meeting is being hosted through Seattle PTSA's Zoom account, and I am your Seattle Council PTSA president. And we are on day 80 of a 105-day legislative session. We're at the end, and we're really leaning into trying to get our priorities met as much as we can. We're coming to terms with the fact that as hard as we've advocated, it hasn't been enough. And our legislators are not prioritizing special education funding in the way that we asked them to. The House budget, as Director Rankin said, does not have the funding that we asked for. We asked for the amount that OSPI, the Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction, said we needed. And they made this analysis based on the amount that the state was funding versus the amount that school districts across the state were spending from local dollars. And across the state, school districts are spending $400 million of levy money on basic education because the state is not funding what they should. And the House put forward a budget that includes $139 million instead of the $1 billion over a biennium for 2 years that is needed. The Senate puts forward more money, but it maintains a cap of 15%. And directors Rankin and Song Maritz have talked about this. And at 15%, we have Washington State PTA did an analysis of districts across the state, and they found that 48% of the districts in Washington would be above the 15% cap. There is a tendency when I say that I'm from Seattle for people to say, what's wrong with Seattle? So I wanted us to make sure that we're looking at this from that state lens and the state perspective as we're talking about state funding. So what can we do? Well, you can sign up for our advocacy email list. You can, if your PTA has an advocacy chair, make sure that they are signed up and that they come to the monthly advocacy meetings. And you can email your legislators and tell them that you would like to see in the budget and in their priorities funding for special education, and that you're disappointed in what they have put forward. But if they have to make a choice, the amount of dollars in the Senate budget is preferred. I'm putting into the chat a link to a district finder. If you click on that, you can find out who your legislators are. You can email them directly. Right now, there are very few opportunities to testify in the legislature. There are very few opportunities left. But there will be a bill in Ways and Means on Saturday, and that'll be 5311, which is our special education funding bill. And what you can do is sign in pro on that bill. Because of the way the legislature works, this will be they'd like to move through things very quickly. So we're not asking for tons and tons of testifiers on these bills. Senate Bill 5311 will be in appropriations in the House on Saturday. 1436, which doesn't have much in the way of funding at all anymore in it, will be in the Senate on Friday. That's going to be a more complicated one. So what we're asking for people to do is sign in pro on 5311. And you can do that. There's a link in the chat that starts out with app.leg.wa.gov. You can click on that to sign in pro. And if you want to provide written testimony and say that you would like the cap to be eliminated, you can do that. And so, June, I think you've got 5311 in there. 5311 is what we want. But the thing is that you can also just email your legislators and just say this is a priority for you and that you've been watching this and that this is something they need to focus on and that this matters. Because legislators are moved by their constituents and we are all constituents. So reach out and let them know that this is something that really needs to be done. And when we wrap up tonight, after we wrap up, we're going to close out with an example of testimony. I testified on the House budget, the House operating budget this week. So I wanted you to see kind of a little bit of what we're doing on behalf of PTA to make sure that legislators are still hearing the voices of our communities and the voices that you've been bringing forward through your PTAs and through Seattle Council PTSA, and how we're working to make sure that your legislators know that this is something that is vitally important to our students, our families, and our schools, and that we are really, truly paying attention. So I wanted to make sure we have all of those things because we've been leaning in, and unfortunately our legislators have not fully embraced the needed funding concept. So I really wanted to say thank you to everybody and to give our first of all, really a huge amount of appreciation to our school board directors, and a big thank you to our ASL interpreters. And I wanted to give directors Rankin and Song Maritz an opportunity to wrap up, and then we'll close out with a little bit of super exciting budget testimony. It's only 60 seconds because that's all they give you to say. But thank you, everybody.
Thanks everybody for coming tonight. This for me was personally very helpful to see the kinds of questions that our community has. This is the kind of conversation that will really inform the questions I will ask the district, and how the board will work together to give direction to Dr. Jones and his team. I invite all of you to continue to reach out to us. I think Liza and I are really responsive on email personally. Not to say our colleagues are not, but I do read all my emails, and I really do try to respond to as many as I can. So I will put my contact information in the chat. The kind of things that you all were bringing forward today is exactly the kind of information that I'm looking for. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you all so much for sharing part of your evening with us on a not super exciting, well, if you're nerds like we are, it is exciting, but you know, this is kind of the long slog kind of complex conversations that are hard to have, and there's so much more, you know, we could talk about this stuff for 5 hours and still just kind of scratch the surface. So hopefully we provided a good foundation and some ideas about how decisions get made, because I think ultimately that seems to be, you know, something I know we're trying to do better is stuff happens that we don't want, we don't like, but when we can share with the community why, it helps us all come together around challenging things and understand what we're each going through, understand why different things are important. And also it just helps, you know, when something crappy happens and you don't know why, that just makes it 10 times worse. If you can understand why and understand how you might be able to participate in the solution or prevent the thing from happening in the future, you know, I think that's really what I see our role as the school board. Our next regular board meeting with the full board is on Tuesday next week, because Wednesday is the first night of Passover. And so it's on a Tuesday next week. So if you're looking to tune in, just be aware that it's not on the day it usually is. I recognize a lot of names in here, so you probably have been at board meetings or logged in, but all of our regular board meetings are open to the public, of course. And you know, we try to do our work and keep them kind of boring, because that's, you know, the exciting stuff is happening in our classrooms, not the boardroom. The exciting stuff is happening between, you know, kids and educators and the children of our city growing and learning. And but you know, definitely tune into the board meeting and see what we're talking about. And like Vivian said, email us. Let us know what questions you have, what questions you think maybe we're not asking that we should be asking. If there's something that you're experiencing that seems really different from what's being expressed, and you know, it doesn't line up with what the intention is, you know, that's all stuff that's really that we want to hear from you. Yeah, legislative session, there's more to come. So fingers crossed, and thank you all again. And thank you to Sam and Seattle Council PTSA, and to our interpreters, and to the school district actually for supporting us with getting interpretation tonight.
All right, so I want to just say thank you to everybody. I did put in the chat, if you're having questions about how to sign in on a bill, what to do, I do weekly drop-in hours. I put info about how to find those. I've got one tomorrow at 9 a.m. And so if you're thinking tomorrow morning that you really want to follow up on something, that's a great place to do it. You can always check the scptsa.org calendar. It's got links on there. And so again, thank you, everybody. We're going to close out with testimony because that's the exciting way to wrap up an evening. But I'm hoping that we really lean into connecting with our legislators and working for change. And we know that there are many, many more legislative sessions to come in the future, and we will we'll keep working even after the legislative session is over. Thank you all. All right, June, if you can share the testimony, and then we'll just wrap up.
And Samantha Fogg online, please go ahead.
Chair Ormsby and members of the committee, for the record, my name is Samantha Fogg, President of Seattle Council PTSA, representing all the PTAs and PTSAs in Seattle. Two things that are easy to talk about and harder to pay for, civil rights and safety, and our budgets show our values. When it comes to disability, because of the fact that these systems were not built for us, civil rights and access costs are inextricably linked. This budget does not value the civil rights of our disabled youth who require special education services to access basic education. $139 million per biennium is a tenth of what districts are currently spending unconstitutionally out of levy dollars for basic education. This budget does value the safety of our staff and our students through providing $15 million for professional development to give educators strategies that work to prevent the dangerous practices of isolation and chemical and mechanical restraint, practices that are most often used on our youngest students. We urge you to fund special education at least the amount in the Senate's budget. We ask you to please maintain the funding for preventing isolation and restraint. This professional development is needed urgently. We cannot wait on this. Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Mack.
Good night, everyone.
Good night, all.
Good night.
Good night.
Thanks for being here, Bev.
No problem. We'll touch base later. Bye.
Great.